The badge hit the wall hard enough to crack the plastic casing. Dr. Harlan Voss didn't even look at where it landed. He was already turning away, already dismissing her, already done with the conversation before it finished. "Get her out of my ER," he said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. "She's suspended. Effective right now." Nora Calloway stood in the center of the trauma bay, 31 years old, still wearing her gloves, a patient's blood drying on her forearm. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She looked at Voss the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved in their head and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Then the ambulance bay doors opened. A man in a Navy service dress uniform walked through. 4 stars on his shoulders, posture like something carved from bedrock. And he stopped. He looked at Nora, and whatever he saw made the color leave his face entirely. "Iron Veil," he said. Not loud, just enough. And every single person in that room went quiet. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go back to where it started. The overnight shift at Mercy Dunmore Medical Center started the same way it always did. Short-staffed, undersupplied, and with the particular smell of industrial cleaner failing to cover something it shouldn't have needed to cover in the first place. Nora Calloway clocked in at 10:47 p.m., 13 minutes late because the parking structure elevator had been broken for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and she'd taken the stairs from level 4. She didn't report it. There was a form for that, a facilities request form, and she'd submitted 6 of them over the past year and a half. The elevator still broke. The forms still went nowhere. She'd stopped expecting otherwise. "You're late," said the charge nurse at the station, a heavy-set man named Dale Pruitt, who managed the overnight desk with the energy of someone counting down days to retirement. "Elevator's out again," Nora said. "I'll note it." "Please don't." She dropped her bag behind the nursing station and pulled her hair back, checked the board. 3 patients already waiting, 1 pending discharge, 1 flagged for possible sepsis that someone should have escalated 20 minutes ago. She walked past Dale and into Bay 4 without being asked. The sepsis patient was a 63-year-old woman named Mrs. Alderman. She was gray in the face and breathing shallow, and the IV access looked wrong. The line had infiltrated, fluid going into tissue instead of vein, and nobody had caught it. Nora caught it in 11 seconds. She pulled the line, reassessed the site, got a new IV placed in the antecubital before the woman had time to do more than wince. "Squeeze my fingers," Nora said. The woman did. Weak, but there. "Good. I'm going to get you something for the nausea. Just breathe slowly for me." She stepped out and flagged the attending, a second-year resident named Dr. Priya Mehta, who was juggling 2 other patients and running on what looked like her 4th consecutive hour of controlled panic. Nora gave her the sepsis update in 45 seconds, clean and sequential. Mehta nodded, adjusted the antibiotic order, didn't thank her. Didn't need to. Nora wasn't doing it for thanks. That was the rhythm of Mercy Dunmore overnight. Everyone moving fast, nobody talking much, the whole machinery of the place grinding forward on momentum and caffeine and the particular grim professionalism of people who knew they were under-resourced and showed up anyway. Nora had been part of that rhythm for 4 years, long enough that most of the staff had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a fixture. The trauma nurse. The quiet one. The one who was always already doing the thing before you asked her to do it. She preferred it that way. At 11:30 p.m., the radio crackled. MVA inbound, single vehicle rollover, male, mid-40s, unrestrained driver, loss of consciousness at scene. ETA 6 minutes. Nora was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1 when Dr. Harlan Voss came around the corner and nearly walked into her. Voss was the chief of emergency medicine at Mercy Dunmore. 48 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of silver-templed authority that hospitals cultivated in their senior staff like a cash crop. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. He mentioned it often enough that nobody forgot. He wore his hospital ID on a lanyard with his name facing outward at all times, which Nora had always found quietly telling. "I've got the trauma," she said. Voss looked at her the way he usually looked at her. Not hostile exactly, just indifferent in the particular way of a man who sorted people by credential before he sorted them by competence. Is Meta prepped? She's with the sepsis patient. I can take primary until she's free. I'll take primary. He moved past her. Set up the bay. She set up the bay. The patient came in hard. The paramedics were moving fast, calling out vitals that were already deteriorating, and Nora read the body before she read the chart. Mid-40s, built like someone who'd done physical labor for decades. Laceration across the left orbital ridge, right arm clearly fractured, GCS around 10 by her estimate. But there was something else. The way he was holding his trunk, the subtle asymmetry of his chest rise. Her eyes snagged on it and wouldn't let go. He's guarding his left side, she said. Noted, said Voss, not looking up. She gloved, moved to the left side of the gurney, pressed 2 fingers against the lateral chest wall with careful, specific pressure. The patient's jaw tightened even through his compromised consciousness. She looked at the respiratory pattern again. She looked at his neck veins. Dr. Voss, I think we may have a tension pneumo developing. The S8s are 94, let's not jump. The SATs are 94 and trending down. His trachea is deviating. Voss looked up from the chart then, and the look he gave her had an edge to it. Not the indifferent look, something sharper. The look of a man who had just had his clinical judgment questioned by someone whose badge read RN instead of MD. I said, let's not jump. Get me a chest film. That'll take... Get me the film, Calloway. She got the film ordered. She also positioned herself to keep watching the patient's chest, because the film would take 7 minutes minimum, and she didn't think they had 7 minutes. The attending radiologist was on a different floor. The portable unit was being used in Bay 3. 7 minutes was an estimate that assumed nothing went wrong. Things went wrong in 4. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 88 in 90 seconds. His blood pressure, which had been holding, skidded downward. Nora was already reaching for the needle decompression kit when Voss held up a hand. I didn't order that. His pressure is 82/50, and he's about to code. I am the attending physician in this bay, and I did not. Tracheal deviation, absent breath sounds on the left. Dropping pressure, dropping SATs. She had the kit in her hands. Her voice was completely level. This is a tension pneumo. He needs needle decompression. Right now. Voss stared at her. Something moved through his expression. Not agreement, not acknowledgement, just the slow heat of a man who felt he was being made to look small. Put that down. Dr. Voss, put that down. His voice had gone very quiet. You are a nurse. You will not perform unsanctioned procedures in my bay, and you will not continue to challenge my clinical decisions in front of my staff. Are we clear? The monitor alarm started. Nora looked at Voss. Voss looked at Nora. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Dr. Mehta came through the door at a jog, took one look at the monitor, took one look at the patient's chest, and said, Tension pneumo. I need a needle. Nora handed her the kit. They worked fast. Mehta performing the decompression, Nora managing the airway, the patient's numbers stabilizing within 90 seconds of the needle going in. The man's chest rose and fell evenly. His blood pressure climbed back to something survivable. The room breathed again. Voss hadn't moved from where he was standing. When the immediate crisis had passed and the patient was stable enough to hand off, Voss walked to the nursing station. Nora followed because she knew what was coming, and she'd decided she wasn't going to make it easier for him by standing somewhere else. He took her badge off the lanyard rack without asking. He walked to the center of the trauma bay. And then, in front of Dale at the desk, in front of Mehta, in front of 2 other nurses and 1 surgical resident who had the misfortune of being nearby, Harlan Voss threw Nora Calloway's hospital ID badge at the wall. It cracked, hit the floor. Nobody picked it up. You are suspended, he said. His voice had gone back to that flat, carrying calm. Effective immediately. Insubordination, unauthorized clinical conduct, and willful disregard for the chain of command. Security will escort you out. Nobody in the room said anything. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the badge on the floor. The photo on it was 2 years old. She'd been thinner then, tired in a different way. She looked back up at Voss. The patient's alive, she said. Get her out of my ER. She was in the hallway, security badge confiscated, waiting for a formal escort, when the ambulance doors at the far end of the bay opened again. Nobody had called a new trauma. No radio chatter, no ETA. Just the doors opening and a man walking through them under his own power. Slowly, with the deliberate economy of movement that Nora recognized as someone managing serious pain while refusing to show it. Navy service dress uniform. 4 stars. Silver hair cut close. He was somewhere past 60 and had the kind of face that had spent a long time making decisions in conditions that didn't allow for second guessing. He was supporting his left arm with his right, and the way he was holding himself told Nora 4 things in the first 3 seconds. Blunt force trauma to the left shoulder and lateral thorax, possible rib involvement, elevated pain response, and something else. Something in the color of his lips and the slight flaring of his nostrils that flagged hypoxia even before the monitors touched him. He swept the room once with his eyes. Professional habit. And then his gaze landed on Nora. Standing in the hallway in street clothes now, suspended, waiting for security, and he stopped. Not the way someone stops when they recognize a face. The way someone stops when they recognize a ghost. Iron Veil, he said. 2 words. Quiet enough that only Nora and the 2 nurses nearest the door heard them clearly. But Nora heard them. She went very still. The expression on her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. The way a door looks the same from the outside whether or not there's a storm on the other side. She looked at the officer steadily for a moment, then looked away. "Sir," she said, "you need to be seen immediately. Please come with me." "Who is she?" Voss had come to the doorway, watching. "A nurse," said the officer. His voice had an edge of something that wasn't quite humor. An exceptional one, if I'm remembering correctly. "She's been suspended." The officer looked at Voss for the first time. It was a brief look, the kind of look a man gives a problem he's already classified and dismissed. "Then, unsuspend her." "Excuse me?" "That's not a request." Voss opened his mouth and then closed it again, and Nora watched something she had never seen before. Harlan Voss, Chief of Emergency Medicine, 2-time Department Excellence Award winner, Johns Hopkins trained, choose, very deliberately, to say nothing. The officer's name was Vice Admiral Marcus Thorne. His ID presented to the desk nurse identified him as attached to a naval command group out of Virginia, and the flag codes on his credentials were above Dale's pay grade to interpret, but clearly above anyone's pay grade to question. He'd driven himself to the hospital from a meeting at the state capitol 40 miles north, which was exactly as inadvisable as it sounded. "Why didn't you call an ambulance?" Nora asked, getting him into Bay 2, running her hands along his rib cage with careful, practiced pressure. "Takes longer. Driving while in active trauma takes longer on the back end when you crash." "I didn't crash. You drove 40 miles with at least 3 fractured ribs, and what I'm guessing is a partial pneumothorax on the left side. Left arm held rigid the whole way, probably to splint the pain. Right hand on the wheel." She looked at him directly. "How many near misses?" He was quiet for a moment. 2. "So you almost died twice on the way to get help for almost dying." She pressed her stethoscope to his left lung base and listened. "Deep breath." He breathed. She listened. She moved the stethoscope. "You were in Falconer Province," she said. The words were quiet, factual, not a question. The Vice Admiral went very still. "That's classified," he said finally. "I know. I was there." She didn't look up. She was listening to his right lung now, comparing. "Sit forward slightly." He sat forward. The blast injury signature was unmistakable to anyone who'd seen it before. The particular pattern of concussive force trauma to the lateral torso, the kind that came from a pressure wave in an enclosed space rather than from direct impact, was something civilian emergency medicine almost never encountered. Vehicle rollovers could do something like it, industrial accidents occasionally, but the distribution on Thorne's body, the way the damage tracked inward from a specific vector, was something Nora had seen documented in exactly one context. She'd also treated it, twice, under conditions she had never discussed with anyone at Mercy Dunmore Medical Center. Dr. Mehta appeared in the bay doorway, looking at the Admiral's rank insignia with the carefully composed expression of someone whose brain was working faster than their face. "I can take primary," she said. "I'm here," said Nora. Mehta looked at her. "You're suspended." "I know." Nora kept working. "Someone should probably tell someone that." Mehta looked at Admiral Thorne. Thorne looked at Mehta with that same brief, classifying look he'd given Voss. Mehta retreated to the doorway. The injury was more complex than the first assessment suggested. Beyond the fractured ribs and the partial pneumothorax, Nora found what she was looking for 22 minutes into the examination, a pressure injury to the deep lateral musculature that looked, on the surface, like bruising, but carried a specific pattern of tissue tension that indicated vascular involvement, not visible on a standard chest film, not something a physician unfamiliar with blast trauma mechanics would think to look for, not something that would announce itself loudly until it became catastrophic. She put her hand flat against his left lateral abdomen, held it there, pressed with careful, graduated force. "Does this feel like pressure or pain?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "Both." "On a scale? 7. "How long have you had it?" "Since the incident. 3 hours ago." She stepped back, ran the sequence in her head the way she always did, not scrambling, not rushing, just working through it systematically the way she'd been trained, the way she'd trained herself, before she'd had access to training, the way she'd had to learn because people were dying, and waiting for someone more qualified wasn't an option. "You have a deep vascular contusion on the left lateral abdomen that's going to rupture if you don't have it addressed surgically." She said it plainly, the way she always delivered bad information. "The timeline is somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours depending on what your body does next. The pneumothorax I can manage here. The abdominal injury needs a surgeon." Thorne looked at her for a long moment. "You're certain?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Then let's move." She was reaching for the phone to page surgery when Harlan Voss walked back into the bay. He'd had time to compose himself. The flatness was back, the professional, credentials-forward flatness, and he moved into the space with the particular momentum of a man who decided he was reclaiming territory. "I'll take over from here, he said. "Calloway, you've been suspended. I need you to leave the bay. I've identified a deep vascular spot. I heard your assessment." He moved to Thorne's right side, picked up the chart Nora had started, scanned it with the studied efficiency of a man performing competence rather than exhibiting it. "Admiral, I apologize for any confusion. I'm Dr. Harlan Voss, Chief of Emergency Medicine. I'll be managing your care from this point." Thorne looked at Voss. Then he looked at Nora. Then he looked back at Voss. "She stays," he said. Voss smiled the way people smile when they're about to explain something to someone they consider slow. "Sir, I understand she may have made a positive first impression, but she's a nurse, but a suspended nurse, and there are protocols. She identified a mechanism of injury that requires surgical intervention that you haven't assessed for yet." Thorne's voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. "She stays. You can stay too if you'd like to help." The smile didn't survive that. What happened next was the particular discomfort of a man like Voss forced to occupy the same professional space as a person he'd tried to remove from it. He stayed, technically, but he hovered at the periphery of it, ordering tests Nora had already ordered, asking questions whose answers were already in the chart, inserting himself at the edges of the process in ways that were more about presence than contribution. The vascular surgery resident who responded to the page was a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Isha Korapati, 3 years into her residency, who walked in, looked at Nora's notes, looked at the ultrasound images Nora had ordered, and said, "Who did this workup?" "She did," said Thorne. Korapati looked at Nora. "This is a blast trauma presentation." "Yes." "Where did you see this?" Nora met her eyes. "Somewhere I'm not going to discuss right now." Korapati looked at her for a beat longer than the question required. Then she looked at the images again. "He needs an OR now." "That's what I said," said Nora. They moved Thorne towards surgery at 1:14 a.m. The hallway transition took 90 seconds. Gurney, equipment, The surgical resident coordinating with the OR team by phone, the whole machine clicking into motion. Nora walked alongside. She was not supposed to be there. She was suspended. She had no badge, no clearance, no institutional standing in that moment. She walked alongside anyway because someone needed to hand off the injury data to the OR team correctly, and she was the only person who fully understood what she'd found. At the OR door, Thorne caught her wrist. Not hard, just enough. "You need to tell me your name," he said. "Your real service name." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, looked up at his face. Something moved through her expression, not the door with the storm behind it this time, but the storm itself, briefly visible. Just briefly. "You already know it," she said. She stepped back as the OR doors swung open. The surgical team took him. The doors swung closed. She was standing in the hallway outside the operating suites in an empty corridor with no badge and no official reason to be in the building at all when Voss found her. He had 2 security officers with him this time. The message was clear. The informal suspension was now becoming something with witnesses. "We need to talk about what just happened in there," he said. "The patient is in surgery. The injury was what I said it was. The intervention is what I recommended." Her voice was even. "If you want to discuss it formally, I'll need union representation." "What I want," said Voss, "is for you to explain how a trauma nurse at a regional medical center knows how to identify blast vascular trauma from a classified military operation." He paused. "Because that's what Dr. Korapati is saying you just did. And that's not something that's in any nursing curriculum I've ever seen." The hallway was quiet. The corridor lights hummed. Nora looked at Voss, then at the security officers. Then she looked back at Voss with the specific expression of someone who has decided, after a long time of deciding otherwise, to stop managing other people's comfort. "There are a lot of things about me that aren't in any curriculum," she said. "Get someone from administration. I'll wait." She sat down in one of the hallway chairs outside the OR suite. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the opposite wall. Inside the OR, Marcus Thorne was on a table, and a surgeon was working to repair a vascular injury that most physicians in the building wouldn't have known to look for. The injury that Nora had found in 22 minutes. The injury that would have killed him quietly, unremarkably, in another hour or less. The hallway was empty except for Nora and the echo of the fluorescent lights. Down the corridor, back in the ER, Dale Pruitt was on the phone with someone. His voice was low. He kept glancing at the hallway camera. The words were too quiet to make out from here, but his expression had the particular tightness of a man delivering news he didn't fully understand but knew was significant. Nora didn't move, didn't look at him, didn't look at the security officers who had stationed themselves 10 feet from her chair, as though she were a flight risk rather than a woman who had chosen to sit down and wait. She thought about the OR. She thought about the injury pattern, the specific vector of force, the signature of a pressure wave in an enclosed space. She thought about the last time she'd seen that pattern, and where, and what the conditions had been. She thought about the name Marcus Thorne had spoken in the trauma bay, Iron Veil. She hadn't heard that phrase spoken out loud in 4 years. She had spent 4 years in this hospital, in this city, working overnight shifts and filing facilities reports that went nowhere, and learning the names of patients she'd probably never see again, being invisible by design and by necessity. She had built a careful, ordinary life around the particular skill of not being noticed. She had been noticed tonight. The OR light above the double doors flipped from green to amber as the surgical team moved into the complex phase of the repair. Nora watched the light change. Somewhere in the building, someone was making phone calls she hadn't authorized. Somewhere in the building, her personnel file was being accessed, and whoever was accessing it was finding 4 years of nursing records and, before that, a gap. A clean, deliberate gap where there should have been a history. The security officer on her left shifted his weight, looked at her, looked away. Nora sat with her hands folded and watched the amber light above the OR doors and did not let herself think about what came next. Not yet. One thing at a time, one problem at a time. Thorne first. Then whatever came after Thorne. The light stayed amber, the hallway stayed quiet. And somewhere in Mercy Dunmore Medical Center, at 2:03 in the morning, A man who had walked into the wrong hospital on the wrong night was beginning to understand that the woman who'd just saved his life was not the person her personnel file claimed her to be. At 2:47 a.m., the OR light changed from amber to white. Nora knew what white meant. White meant the acute phase was done. White meant the surgeon had found what she'd said they would find, had repaired what she'd said needed repairing, and the patient was being closed. She had been sitting in that hallway chair for 43 minutes, and in that time the security officer on her left had been replaced by a different security officer, and a woman from hospital administration named Greta Solano had appeared at the far end of the corridor and stood there with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had been woken up and was not handling it gracefully. Solano walked toward her now, heels clicking on linoleum in the particular rhythm of institutional authority. "Miss Calloway?" She consulted the clipboard as though Nora's name might have changed since she last checked. "I've been asked to formalize the suspension and collect your badge and access credentials. Security already took my badge. Then we need a signature acknowledging—" "Who asked you to come down here?" Nora interrupted. Not rudely, just directly. Solano blinked. "Dr. Voss?" "At 3 in the morning." Nora looked at her. "He called you at 3 in the morning to formalize a paperwork issue." Something shifted in Solano's expression. Not sympathy, but the faint discomfort of a woman who was smart enough to sense when she was being used as a prop in someone else's play. She recovered quickly. "The suspension paperwork is time-sensitive when it involves—" "It's not time-sensitive. You both know it's not time-sensitive." Nora stood up. She was taller than Solano by 3 inches, and she used none of that in an aggressive way, just stood upright, tired and steady. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. I'd like union representation present when I do." "That's your right, of course, but then I'll wait for that. Thank you for coming down." Solano stood there for a moment with the clipboard held against her chest, recalibrating. Then she went back down the corridor. The security officers remained. Nora sat back down. The white light above the OR doors held steady. She was running through the injury timeline again. Habit, not anxiety, the way a musician's fingers move through a progression without being told. When the OR doors opened and Dr. Korapati came through them, still in her gown, mask pulled down around her neck. She stopped when she saw Nora, looked at the security officers, looked back at Nora. "He's stable," she said. "Good. The vascular damage was exactly where you mapped it." Korapati's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, the particular quality of a person working to keep their professional composure while their brain was doing something considerably less composed. "The attending on call said he's never seen that presentation outside of a combat trauma database. It's uncommon. It's not in any civilian trauma protocol I've seen." She took one step closer, lowered her voice slightly, though the security officers were far enough away that it didn't matter much. "Where did you train?" Nora looked at her steadily. "I've been here 4 years." "Before here?" The silence between them stretched for 3 seconds. "You did good work tonight," Nora said. "The repair was fast. He was lucky you were on call." Korapati held her gaze for another moment, then accepted that she wasn't going to get an answer and let it go. "He's asking for you. He's out of anesthesia already. Regional block. He was awake most of the time." A pause. "He told the OR team you saved his life twice. Once in the bay and once by catching what you caught." She glanced toward the security officers again. "They're going to stop you." "Probably. Is there anything I can do?" Nora thought about it honestly. If someone from a federal agency shows up asking questions, don't make them wait. That's all. Korapati looked at her with the expression of a very intelligent person, adding numbers that were coming out to a sum she hadn't expected. Then she went back through the OR doors. The next hour passed in increments. Solano reappeared twice, both times without the union rep Nora had requested, both times finding a reason to leave again without an actual confrontation. Voss sent a resident to relay a message, something about formal termination proceedings, the language vague enough to be threatening without being actionable, and Nora sent the resident back with her union rep's phone number and nothing else. The security officers changed again at 4 a.m. The new one on the right was young, maybe 23, and he kept looking at her the way people look at something they can't quite categorize. At 4:19 a.m., two men walked in from the main entrance. They weren't in uniform. They were in the particular civilian dress of people who wanted to look like they weren't anything specific while being very clearly something specific. Dark slacks, plain jackets, the kind of posture you couldn't buy at a department store. One of them, the taller one, had a badge on his belt that Nora clocked from 15 feet away. Federal. She couldn't read the agency from here. They spoke briefly to the charge desk. The charge nurse, a different one now, a woman named Patty, who worked the 3 to 7 overlap and had no patience for anything complicated, pointed down the corridor toward Nora without ceremony. The taller one walked toward her. His partner stayed near the desk. Standard positioning. Ms. Calloway. He didn't extend a hand. I'm Agent Breckenridge, Defense Intelligence. Can you come with us? The security officers looked at each other. Nora looked at Breckenridge. Mid-40s, careful eyes, the particular stillness of someone trained to say less than they were thinking. Am I being detained? No. Then I need to know the nature of... It relates to Vice Admiral Thorne and an active security matter. He paused. We've been in contact with the hospital administrator on duty. Your suspension is being held pending the outcome of this conversation. She stood up. Where? There's a conference room on the administrative level. We'd prefer... I know where the conference rooms are. She started walking. I've worked here 4 years. Breckenridge fell into step beside her. His partner followed. The security officers did not. The conference room on the administrative level was a beige rectangle with a table that seated 12 and was currently occupied by 3 people who hadn't been there before. A woman in her 50s with a Navy insignia on her collar, a man in civilian clothes who had the particular weight of a lawyer, and to Nora's moderate surprise, Harlan Voss. Voss looked different than he had in the ER. The authority posture was the same, the lanyard was the same, but something in his face had shifted since Nora had last seen him. He looked like a man who had started a controlled fire and was watching it spread in directions he hadn't planned for. The woman with the Navy insignia introduced herself as Captain Diane Farwell, attached to Thorne's command group. She didn't introduce the man with the lawyer's weight, which Nora noted. Sit down, Ms. Calloway, Farwell said. Nora sat. You correctly identified and flagged a blast trauma presentation in Vice Admiral Thorne that our own medical review team later confirmed was accurate. Farwell folded her hands on the table. The vascular injury you mapped was repaired successfully. The surgical team believes your early identification was the deciding factor in the outcome. She paused. We want to understand how. I have 4 years of trauma nursing experience. We've reviewed your personnel file. The lawyer Waitman spoke for the first time. Your nursing license is current. Your record here is clean. Your employment history prior to this position shows a 2-year gap. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. An unexplained 2-year gap. The room was very quiet. People have gaps, Nora said, not people who can identify classified blast trauma signatures in under 30 minutes. Farwell leaned forward slightly. The Vice Admiral recognized you, Ms. Calloway. He used a designation when he entered the ER, Iron Veil. Nora held Farwell's gaze and said nothing. Iron Veil is a classified designation attached to a joint Army-Navy field medical program that was active 8 years ago. It was decommissioned, officially, 5 years ago. Farwell's voice was neutral, professional, the voice of someone reading from a report and choosing not to editorialize. The program's records are sealed under a national security classification order. The personnel attached to it were given the option to return to active duty or transition out under confidentiality agreement. She paused. One member of the program was listed as casualties unconfirmed following an overseas incident. Her records were sealed separately. The man without a name wrote something on a legal pad. Voss was watching Nora with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the clinical dismissal, not the flat authority. Something closer to alarm, though he was working hard to keep it managed. I'm going to need that union representative, Nora said. Of course. Farwell didn't move. But before we go through formal channels, the Vice Admiral is awake and asking for you. Whatever else happens in this room, that request takes priority on our end. She paused again. He said to tell you that the standing order still applies, whatever that means. Something moved through Nora's chest. Not visibly. Nothing showed. But her hands, which had been still on the table in front of her, shifted slightly. A small, involuntary regrounding. She brought them back to stillness. "I'll see him," she said. "The rest of this can wait." Thorne's recovery room was on the surgical floor, 3rd level, and they walked her there with Farwell and Breckenridge flanking her in the elevator in what was technically not an escort, but was functionally one. The floor was quiet at this hour. Low lights, the muffled sounds of monitoring equipment, one nurse moving at the far end of the corridor. They stopped at the door. Farwell stayed outside. Nora went in alone. Thorne was propped at a partial incline, the regional block still working the left side of his body into something manageable, his color better than it had been 3 hours ago in the trauma bay. He looked like a man who was in considerable pain and was applying considerable practice to not showing it. When Nora came through the door, he looked at her with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting. "You could have walked," he said. "When they suspended you, you could have left the building." The patient was still presenting. She pulled the chair to the bedside. "You weren't stable. You stayed and took the hit anyway. Staying was the right call." He studied her for a moment. "That's exactly what you said the last time. Different context." She didn't answer that. "I wasn't sure you were real," he said. "When I came through those doors and saw you standing there, I thought, I don't know what I thought, that the pain was doing something to my head." He shifted carefully against the pillows. "It's been 4 years. 4 years. We were told you didn't make it out of the valley. I almost didn't." She said it flatly, the way she said most things. Not to avoid the weight of it, but because the weight was just part of the sentence and there was no reason to treat it otherwise. "It took me a while to get back. There were people who looked." "I know." A pause. "I needed time that I couldn't ask for officially." He was quiet for a moment. The monitoring equipment measured out the silence in small, steady increments. "They're going to open the records," he said. "This conversation, this night, it's going to pull the thread on everything that was sealed. You understand that?" "I figured." "Your cover here is gone." "My cover here was already gone the second you said that call sign in the trauma bay." She looked at him steadily. "How bad was the incident, the thing that brought you here tonight?" His jaw tightened. "That's not something I identified your injury from the blast signature. I know the weapon class and the approximate detonation distance, which means I know the operational context, which means I already have a framework." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for classified details. I'm asking if you're the only person who needs to be looked at." Something shifted in his expression, the careful professional management cracking slightly, just at the edges. He hadn't expected that question. Or maybe he'd expected it and hadn't expected to be relieved someone was asking it. "There were 2 others," he said. "They were evaluated at a different facility, both cleared." "By physicians who know blast trauma?" A pause. "I'll need names," she said. "And the facility. I can make a call." "You're suspended." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You really didn't change." "I got better at parking garage stairs." Something crossed his face. The ghost of something that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. He reached for the notepad on the tray beside him, wrote 2 names and a facility code, and held it out. She took it. She didn't look at it yet. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed, gone quieter, with the particular weight of something he'd been carrying and was about to set down. "The facility reports, the safety ones." He watched her. "I've been told you've been filing them for years." She went still. "Someone on my staff flagged them 8 months ago," he said. "During a routine review of regional hospital compliance, the reports were filed correctly. They were also never actioned. Someone in the administrative chain was sitting on them." His eyes were steady on hers. "We've been trying to figure out why." Nora looked at the notepad in her hands. The names, the facility code. She thought about the facility's request forms. The elevator, the 6 submissions, the parking structure. She thought about the equipment reports she'd filed on the crash cart in Bay 3, the one that had failed to charge correctly twice in 18 months and been signed off as functional both times. She thought about the inspection records she'd requested and been denied. She thought about the night, 14 months ago, when a patient in Bay 2 had nearly died during a resuscitation attempt because the defibrillator had delivered inconsistent output, and the incident report she'd written had come back to her with 2 lines redacted and a note from administration that said the matter had been reviewed internally. "How many reports?" she asked. 47, he said. "Over 3 years. All filed. None escalated." She kept looking at the notepad. Nora. He used her name, the real one. The one that nobody in this hospital used because the name in her file was the name on her nursing license, and that was the name she answered to. Hearing her actual name in this building, in this room, in this context, was like a frequency she'd almost forgotten could be heard. Whatever they've been doing in this building, someone was making sure no one looked at it, and you were filing the reports that would have made someone look. The monitoring equipment kept its rhythm. Outside the window of the recovery room, the sky over Denton Falls was beginning to lose its full black. Not light yet, not even close, just the particular giving up of deep night before anything replaced it. The parking structure was a dark shape against a dark sky. Somewhere in it, on level 4, the elevator was still broken. She stood up, folded the notepad once and put it in her pocket. "I need to make a call," she said. "There's a secure line. I have one." She was at the door when he spoke again. "They're not going to let you back in the building after tonight. Voss will make sure of it." She turned, looked at him. "I just saved your life." "Yes." "And before that I saved the man in Bay 1. "Yes." "And for 4 years I have worked in that ER and filed reports that nobody read and shown up to overnight shifts that nobody thanked me for and done the job that needed doing." Her voice hadn't risen. It was completely, carefully level. "Let Voss do what he's going to do." She walked out. The corridor was empty except for Farwell, who straightened when Nora came through the door and read something in her face that made her reach for her phone before either of them said a word. "I need access to a secure federal line," Nora said. "I can arrange, and I need the name of whoever has been processing Mercy Dunmore's regional compliance reports for the last 3 years." She looked at Farwell directly. "Because someone has been burying them, and I need to know if the person doing the burying was doing it alone." Farwell held her gaze. Somewhere behind her careful captain's composure, something had shifted. The recognition of a conversation that had just moved into territory she hadn't fully briefed for. "Who are you?" Farwell said. Not unkindly, just honestly. Down the corridor, Nora's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number. Federal Exchange prefix. She looked at it. She looked at Farwell. "Someone your Vice Admiral trusted with his life," she said, and answered the call. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Nora stood in the corridor outside Thorne's recovery room with Farwell 6 feet away, pretending not to listen and doing a reasonable job of it. The voice on the other end of the line was a man she had spoken to exactly twice before, once during an intake debrief, once during the incident that had ended her service record. He had a flat Midwestern accent and the particular economy of speech of someone who had spent decades saying important things in rooms where every word was being documented. He didn't ask how she was. She didn't expect him to. "We have the flag on Thorne's admission," he said. "The compliance reports are already in front of the right people. We need 24 hours. The hospital is going to move on termination paperwork inside of 6. Can you hold it? Not without legal standing." A pause. "We can get you temporary federal witness status by 800. It won't stop the termination, but it'll complicate any retaliatory action. I need the name of whoever was processing the regional compliance submissions." Another pause. Longer. "That's an active inquiry." "I know it is. I need the name anyway." The silence on the line had a texture to it. Not hesitation exactly, more like the sound of a calculation being run in real time. "Harwick," he said finally, "Regional Compliance Director, State Health Authority. He's been in the chair 11 years. Is he alone?" "We don't know yet." "Then you need to move faster than 24 hours, Nora said, and ended the call. Farwell hadn't moved. "Witness status," she said, as though confirming she'd heard. She hadn't been pretending, after all. "By 0800. Farwell looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman revising her operational picture mid-field. Then she pulled out her own phone and started making her own call, walking 4 paces away to do it. Nora led her. She stood in the corridor and looked at the closed door of Thorne's room and thought about a man named Harwick who had been sitting on 47 safety reports for 3 years and what that meant for every patient who had come through Mercy Dunmore in that time. She thought about the woman in Bay 4, Mrs. Alderman, with the infiltrated IV line that nobody had caught. She thought about the defibrillator in Bay 2. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it in the abstract was not useful, and useful was the only mode she had available right now. At 5:15 a.m., Nora was in the administrative conference room with a union representative named Gerald Foss, who had driven in from the city at Nora's request and arrived with coffee, a legal pad, and the grim professional energy of a man who had been doing this long enough to recognize when a standard suspension had become something considerably less standard. He reviewed the suspension paperwork in 11 minutes. He asked 4 questions. He wrote down 3 numbers. "They don't have grounds for termination," he said. "The insubordination claim doesn't hold if the patient outcome supports your clinical call, and it clearly does. The unauthorized procedure claim is complicated because you handed the kit to the attending and she performed the intervention." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "They know this. Voss knows this. So the question is what this is actually about." "The safety reports," Nora said. "Talk to me." She talked to him. She kept it clean and sequential. The reports, the dates, the specific incidents, the equipment failures, the administrative responses. Foss took notes without interrupting. He was good at his job in the unglamorous, workmanlike way of someone who had never expected to be celebrated for it and had made peace with that early on. When she finished, he set his pen down. "You have copies of the reports?" "Personal copies, filed simultaneously through the hospital system and through the state submission portal. The state portal submissions would have timestamps." "They do." He looked at his legal pad. Then he looked at Nora with the expression of a man recalibrating the scope of his morning. "This is bigger than a suspension proceeding." "Yes." "Are you prepared for what that means?" She thought about Thorne saying, "Your cover here is gone." She thought about 4 years of overnight shifts and parking garage stairs and the particular loneliness of being invisible by design. She thought about what the alternative to that loneliness had looked like and what it had cost. "Yes," she said. The morning shift change happened at 6 a.m., and with it came the particular disruption of institutional rhythm that Nora had always found useful. Too many people moving, too many conversations, the incoming staff not yet fully briefed, and the outgoing staff too tired to explain everything thoroughly. In the controlled chaos of shift change, a suspended nurse sitting in the administrative corridor with a union rep and a federal witness status pending didn't generate the kind of focused attention it would have generated at 2 a.m. People walked by. Some of them recognized her. Most of them looked away with the careful non-engagement of people who sensed something significant was happening and had decided they didn't want to be part of it yet. Meta was not one of those people. She appeared at the conference room door at 6:14 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, which meant she hadn't gone home. She looked at Nora. She looked at Foss. She looked at the legal pad. "Can I come in?" she asked. "That depends on what you want," Nora said. "To tell you something." She came in, stood near the door, not quite committing to the room. "After you went upstairs with the Admiral, Voss called a staff meeting. At 4 in the morning, whoever was still here," she paused. "He told the staff that you'd falsified your credentials, that your clinical experience was misrepresented on your application, and that's why you were suspended." She met Nora's eyes. He said it like it was already established fact. The room was quiet for a moment. "What did the staff say?" Nora asked. Most of them didn't say anything. Meta's jaw was tight. Dale backed him up. The 2 nurses from Bay 1 backed him up. A pause. "I didn't." Foss wrote something on his legal pad. "He's trying to establish a narrative before the federal review gets traction," Nora said. "Not to Meta, exactly. More to herself, working it through. If the story becomes credential fraud, it reframes everything I filed as unreliable." "Can he make that stick?" Meta asked. "Not if the federal witness status comes through, and not if we move on the compliance records before he gets his version in front of a board. She looked at Meta. Why are you here, Priya? Meta looked slightly startled at the directness. Then she straightened. Because I've been here 2 years and I know what I've seen. The equipment in Bay 3 fails twice a week and gets cleared by maintenance every time. The crash cart in the trauma hall was out of calibration for 6 weeks last spring, and nobody escalated it. I know, because I flagged it myself and it went nowhere. She paused. I want to know where to send a formal statement. Foss slid a business card across the table. Meta picked it up. There may be more people willing to talk, she said, if someone asks. Someone's going to ask, Nora said. Meta left. Foss looked at Nora. She's going to be useful. She's going to be brave, Nora said. Those aren't always the same thing. The witness status came through at 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes ahead of the promised window, which was either a good sign or meant things were moving faster on the federal end than she'd been told. Farwell delivered the documentation personally, setting a folder on the conference table with the economy of someone who had carried significant paperwork before and had learned not to editorialize it. The compliance director, Harwick, was brought in for questioning at 700, Farwell said. He's asking for a lawyer, which means he knows why he's there. Is he talking? Not yet. Nora opened the folder, reviewed the witness status documentation in 2 minutes. This protects me from retaliatory termination, but it doesn't restore my access to the floor. Correct. I need floor access. She looked up. If anyone else comes in tonight presenting injuries from the same incident that brought Thorne in, the clinical team here won't know what they're looking at. The 2 staff at the other facility, the ones Thorne mentioned, I've left a message with the medical director there, but if they miss something on assessment, the presentation window is closing. Farwell looked at her steadily. You think there were more injuries? I think a blast event that produces the trauma signature I saw on Thorne in a closed vehicle doesn't stop at one vehicle. She kept her voice even. I think someone needs to be looking at every regional ER admission from last night with lateral thoracic involvement, and I think that someone needs to know what they're looking for. Farwell was already reaching for her phone. The next 3 hours were not clean or organized or efficient. They were the way things actually moved when institutional bureaucracy collided with operational urgency. 2 steps forward, 1 document missing, someone on hold, someone in a meeting that couldn't be interrupted, someone who needed authorization from someone who needed authorization from someone else. Nora sat in the conference room and worked the phone and let Foss handle the hospital side process because she trusted him to do that correctly, and she needed to do this correctly, and there were not enough hours or enough of her to do both. At 9:30 a.m., the medical director at Hendricks Regional, the facility where Thorne's 2 staff had been evaluated, called back. We cleared both of them last night, the director said. His name was Okafor, and he sounded like a man who had been having a very long morning. Standard blunt trauma protocol. One of them had a grade 2 splenic contusion. The other had rib fractures, treated and discharged. Which ribs? Nora asked. A pause. Left lateral, 4 and 5. Was there a vascular workup done on the lateral abdomen? Silence on the line. Then, that's not standard protocol for rib fractures. It is for this mechanism of injury. She kept her voice level. Is the patient still in your facility? He was discharged at 0200. I need a contact number, and I need your attending to call him back in for imaging. She paused. I know that's not a comfortable call to make. What am I looking for, exactly? She told him. She used the clinical language precisely because precision was the only thing that mattered in this conversation, not the weight of what had happened or the exhaustion of the night or the fact that she was sitting in a conference room in a hospital that had suspended her telling another facility's physician what to look for. None of that was relevant. The injury either existed or it didn't. The imaging would show what it showed. Okafor listened. He was quiet for a moment. That presentation isn't in our standard database. I know. How certain are you? Certain enough that I would rather you call him in and find nothing than not call him and be right. A longer silence. I'll get him on the phone. She put the phone down. Foss was watching her from across the table. You've been running on no sleep, he said. I'm aware. There's a limit to... Gerald. She looked at him. After this is done, I will sleep. Right now, there may be a man with an undiagnosed vascular injury sitting at home because a facility discharged him without a complete workup, and that is a problem I can fix from this phone if I work fast enough. Voss held up both hands in acknowledgement and went back to his legal pad. At 10:47 a.m., Okafor called back. "He's in imaging," he said, "and I owe you a conversation when this is over, because what the preliminary scan is showing is—" He stopped, recalibrated. "We would have missed it." Nora closed her eyes. "Just for a second. Get him to surgery." Already paging, she ended the call. Sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, not moving. Voss didn't say anything. He understood the shape of that silence. Then the conference room door opened and everything shifted. Harlan Voss walked in. He was not alone. Behind him was a man Nora didn't recognize, in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, carrying a briefcase with the comfortable authority of someone who was used to entering rooms and immediately owning them. Hospital legal counsel, by the look of it. Maybe private. Voss had made calls of his own this morning. "We need to speak with Ms. Calloway privately," Voss said. Voss didn't move. "I'm her union representative. I stay." The man in the suit, he gave his name as Aldous Prine, which Nora immediately categorized as real because nobody would invent it, set his briefcase on the table and opened it with the deliberate pace of someone who wanted the room to understand he had documentation and time and was comfortable deploying both. He placed a folder on the table. "Mercy Dunmore Medical Center is prepared to offer a resolution to the current dispute," he said. "A negotiated separation with 6-month severance, full COBRA continuation, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement covering the events of the past 12 hours. Nora looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. "That's the offer," she said. "It's a generous one. It's an offer someone makes when they're more afraid of what I know than I am of what they can do to me." She looked at Voss. He was standing near the door, and the alarm in his face was now considerably less managed than it had been 3 hours ago. "How long have you known about Harwick?" Voss said nothing. "Because 47 reports went through a submission system that generates automatic notifications to the attending department heads, which means you were getting pinged every time I filed, and nothing changed." She held his gaze. "So either you didn't read them, or you read them and flagged them down, or you flagged them down because someone told you to, and that someone is more interesting to me than you are." Prine moved to interject. Voss put a hand up. "She's talking," Voss said. Mildly, completely. Voss's jaw was working. "You don't know what you're—" "I know that a compliance director named Harwick is in federal questioning right now, and that he's going to eventually explain who he was protecting the hospital from scrutiny for and why." She stood up, slowly, without drama. "I know that at least 2 patients have been harmed by equipment failures that were reported and not addressed. I know there are 47 documented reports with timestamps that establish a pattern of negligence over 3 years. And I know that the man you humiliated last night in front of your staff and 2 security guards is a former military operator whose injury you dismissed and who would be dead right now if I'd done what you told me to do." She paused. "So take your folder back and tell whoever is running your legal strategy that the window for a negotiated anything closed about 4 hours ago." Prine looked at the folder. He looked at Voss. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man running a probability calculation and not enjoying the result. He picked the folder back up. They left. Voss let out a slow breath. That was either very effective or very inadvisable. Both, probably. "Can I ask you something?" She sat back down. "Go ahead." "The military background, the things you're not saying and the things you clearly know, does it actually connect to what happened at this hospital? Or is it a separate track?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider everything. "Separate tracks that are about to merge," she said. "Thorne recognizing me is what started the Federal Review moving fast. The Federal Review moving fast is what's making the hospital move toward suppression instead of internal management. The suppression is what's going to expose the compliance issue clearly enough that it can't be managed quietly." She looked at Voss. "If he hadn't walked through those doors last night, the reports would still be buried, and I would have filed number 48 next month, and it would have gone the same place the others went." "That's a complicated thing to sit with." "Yes." She picked up her phone. It is. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, different from the Federal Exchange local area code. She called it back. It rang twice. "This is Dale Pruitt," said the voice on the other end. She hadn't expected that. "Dale, I heard you were still in the building." He sounded tired, more tired than the shift change would account for. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not going to pretend this is easy, so I'm just going to say it." A pause. "I knew about the reports, not all of them, but I knew. And when the first couple went nowhere, I asked about it, and I was told by my supervisor that the submissions were under administrative review and to not escalate further." A longer pause. "I should have pushed harder. I know that. I'm not calling to excuse it." Nora listened. "I'm calling because Voss has been talking to 3 of the senior nurses, and I know what he's building. And whatever he's building is going to be wrong. And I've been in this hospital 22 years, and I don't want to retire having been the guy who let that stand." His voice was rougher now. "What do I need to do?" She looked at the legal pad in front of Voss. Voss was already writing. "Can you put a statement in writing?" she said. "Everything you just told me, the dates, the conversations, who gave you the instruction to stand down?" "Yes." "And would you be willing to repeat it to a federal investigator?" A pause, longer than the other ones. "Yes." "Okay, Dale." Her voice, for the first time in several hours, lost some of its careful evenness. Not completely, just enough. "Thank you for calling." She hung up. Sat for a moment. Voss put his pen down. "Now we have something." "Now we have something," she agreed. Her phone buzzed again, Farwell this time. She answered immediately. "The second surgical patient at Hendricks is in the OR, Farwell said. "Your assessment was correct." "I know." "There's something else." Farwell's voice had a quality to it that Nora hadn't heard before. Not alarm, but the careful tone of someone delivering information they know will land with weight. "We pulled the sealed records, Iron Veil, your complete service file." A pause. "There's a commendation in there, from Thorne, dated 5 years ago." Another pause. "He filed it the day after the incident. He filed it and then it got sealed with everything else." Nora was quiet. "He never stopped trying to get it processed," Farwell said. "Every year. The same request, blocked every time by the classification order." A pause. "I thought you should know that." The conference room was very still. Through the window, Denton Falls was fully into its morning, traffic on the street below, the gray October light coming in flat and even, a city doing the ordinary business of being a city. "Thank you," Nora said. She set the phone face down on the table, looked at the wall. Voss, who had heard enough to understand the shape of what had just been said, did not ask questions. He just waited. Then the door opened again. It was not Voss this time, and not Farwell. It was a hospital security officer. Not one of the overnight ones. A different one. A woman named Ruiz, who Nora recognized from day shift, and she had a look on her face that didn't match the situation Nora had spent the morning building toward. "There's a problem in the ER," Ruiz said. "Bay 2. Voss looked at her. "What kind of problem?" "The patient from last night. The MVA. The man from Bay 1. Ruiz's eyes were on Nora. "He's deteriorating. They had him in step down, but he spiked a fever, and his pressure is dropping, and Dr. Voss is in there, but—" She stopped. "But what?" Nora said. "But he's calling for you," Ruiz said. "He keeps saying there's something they're missing. He's saying your name." Nora stood up. "She's suspended," Voss said, not as an objection, just as a fact to be accounted for. "Witness protection status complicates that," Nora said, already moving toward the door. "And so does a patient actively requesting a specific clinician." She looked at Ruiz. "What's the fever?" 103.4 and climbing. "How long since his last imaging?" 6 hours. 6 hours was too long. She went through the door at a pace that was not quite running, because running in hospital corridors created chaos, and chaos cost seconds, and she had already calculated that if she moved efficiently, she would reach Bay 2 in 90 seconds, which was faster than running would actually get her once she accounted for the corners. She was 60 feet from the ER entrance when Voss stepped into the corridor in front of her. He didn't move. He stood in the hallway with his arms at his sides, and the look on his face that was no longer the flat professional authority, that mask was gone now, had been coming apart since 3 a.m., and what was underneath it was something messier and more human, a man who was afraid, and who had made enough decisions out of fear in the past several years that he no longer clearly knew how to make a decision from anywhere else. "You're not going in there," he said. "Patient is requesting me by name with a climbing fever and dropping pressure. Stand aside. You have no clinical standing in this." "Harlan." She stopped, looked at him, said it quietly, the way she said most things. "There is a man in that bay who may be septic from a secondary infection we didn't catch last night. He may also have a retained injury from the original presentation. Every minute we stand here is a minute someone should be spending imaging him." She paused. "You can stand in this hallway and stop me, and he may die, and everyone will know exactly why. Or you can step aside and let me help him, and whatever happens after that, happens after that." She held his gaze. "But you need to decide right now." Voss looked at her. Something moved across his face. The fear, the anger, the career-length habit of authority, and underneath all of it, faint and almost buried, something that might once have been the reason he went to medical school in the first place. He stepped aside. She went through the ER entrance and into Bay 2 and found exactly what she'd feared she would find. A man in his mid-40s with a fever of 103.7, a blood pressure of 88/58, and a look in his eyes that was the particular glassy focus of someone who knew something was badly wrong and was using everything they had to stay present. He looked at her when she came through the curtain. "You're the one," he said, "from last night." "Yes." She was already pulling on gloves. "Tell me where it hurts." "Everywhere," he swallowed. "But here most." His hand moved to his right lower abdomen, not the left side, not where the original presentation had been, the right side. She pressed. He gasped. She looked at the attending. Meta again, back after what could not have been more than 2 hours of sleep, her face tight with the effort of managing something she didn't have the full picture for. "When did this start?" "The right-sided pain? He mentioned it an hour ago. We thought it was referred, well, get me an ultrasound. Right now." She was already palpating. The rigidity under her hands told her something before the imaging could confirm it. "And get surgery on the phone. Tell them we may have a secondary abdominal injury that presented delayed and we don't have time for a formal consult." Meta was on the phone before Nora finished the sentence. The patient looked up at her from the gurney. His eyes were clearer than they should have been for someone in septic shock, which meant he was running on adrenaline and not much else. "Am I going to be okay?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about all the times she'd been asked that question in all the places she'd been asked it, in conditions considerably worse than this room, with considerably fewer resources, with no cavalry coming. She thought about what she'd learned from those times about the specific calculus of honesty. "I'm going to work as hard as I can," she said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." He nodded. Something in his face settled. Not relief, but the particular steadiness of a person who has been told the truth and can work with it. The ultrasound cart arrived. She put the probe to his abdomen. The image resolved on the screen, and she looked at it, and her hands went very still. Behind her, someone pulled back the bay curtain. She heard new voices. Not hospital staff, not the familiar voices of the morning, and when she turned her head slightly without moving the probe, she saw 2 men in federal credentials entering the ER bay, and behind them a woman she didn't recognize in a Defense Department badge, and behind her, being wheeled in a chair by a hospital transport aide, looking pale and stubborn and considerably more functional than he had any right to be 8 hours post-surgery, Vice Admiral Marcus Thorne. He looked at her, looked at the ultrasound screen, looked at the patient on the gurney. "What are we looking at?" he said. "Delayed splenic rupture," she said. "He's been bleeding into his abdominal cavity for the last 2 hours. She looked at Meta. "We need the OR now." "They're setting up," Meta said from the phone. 4 minutes. "We have 2. She kept the probe in position. "Someone tell the transport team to move." She looked at the image on the screen. She looked at the patient. She looked at Thorne, who was watching her with the expression of a man who had known, somewhere in the 7 years since she'd disappeared, that she hadn't changed and was watching himself be proven right. Then the bay curtain opened again, and the face that appeared was not a federal agent, not a surgeon, not anyone Nora had been expecting. It was Greta Solano, the administrative woman with the clipboard, and her face had lost every trace of the institutional composure she'd been wearing since 3 a.m., and in its place was something that looked very much like panic. "There are news cameras in the parking lot," Solano said. "3 networks, someone called them." Nobody moved for a second. "Who called them?" Thorne said. Solano shook her head. "We don't know, but they're asking about a federal investigation and a suspended nurse, and—" She stopped, looked at Nora. "They're asking for you by name." The patient on the gurney chose that moment to flatline. The monitor's alarm cut through everything. Nora was already moving before the second beep, probe down, gloves repositioned, her hand finding the patient's sternum for a sternal rub that got no response. She looked at Meta. Meta was already calling it out loud for the team. The crash cart was 3 feet away. The OR was 4 minutes out. The splenic rupture on the ultrasound screen was not a maybe. "He's in PEA," Nora said. "We're not defibbing this. We need volume, and we need the OR door open in 2 minutes, or we're losing him on this gurney. Vascular is on the way down. They need to be here now." She had her hands on his chest. Compressions. She looked at Meta. 2 large-bore IVs, wide open. O negative if you have it, saline if you don't. Call the blood bank. Meta was already on it. The bay had the particular controlled urgency of a trauma team that knew what it was doing but was working at the edge of its capacity, and Nora drove the center of it the way she always drove the center of things. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the focused specificity of someone who had decided exactly what needed to happen and was making it happen one step at a time. Behind her, Thorne's transport aide had pushed his chair to the curtain line and stopped, which was the right call. Thorne watched. He said nothing. The federal agents had moved back. Solano had not left, which Nora registered peripherally and filed as a problem for later. The blood bank sent O negative. The first bag was running in 90 seconds. The patient's pressure, which had been 88/58 when she'd walked in, had dropped to 74/40. His rhythm on the monitor was electrical activity with no mechanical output. Heart trying, muscle not responding, blood volume insufficient to sustain the loop. She kept compressions going, watched the numbers, watched the door. The vascular surgical team came through the bay entrance at a controlled jog, led by a second-year fellow named Rowan Aldis, who had the look of someone who had been running since the phone rang. He took one look at the ultrasound image still up on the screen, took one look at Nora doing compressions, and said, "Or 2 is ready. He needs volume before transport or he won't survive the elevator." "How much time?" "Give me 90 seconds. She didn't look up. "Keep that elevator on hold." Aldis held the elevator. 90 seconds of fluids, compressions, and the quiet math of a body deciding whether it had enough left to stay in the fight. The monitor shifted, the erratic electrical signal organizing itself slowly into something with a pattern, not strong, not stable, but present. "He's got a rhythm," Meta said. "Pressure?" 82/50. "Good enough." Nora stepped back, let the transport team take the gurney rails. "He needs direct surgical pressure control on the splenic laceration and probably a splenectomy. The secondary injury was missed on the initial workup because the presentation was atypical for the mechanism. The impact vector was oblique, not direct. Make sure the attending knows that." Aldis was writing on his palm. Actual palm. No paper. "Got it." He should have been imaged at 4 hours. The fever was the first indicator. She looked at him directly. "Don't let anyone tell you this was unforeseeable. The timeline is documented." Aldis held her gaze for half a second. The half second of a person understanding that they've just been handed something that matters beyond this patient, beyond this surgery. "Understood," he said. And then the gurney was moving, and he was moving with it, and the bay was suddenly quieter. Nora pulled her gloves off. Her hands were steady. She was aware of being tired in the way she'd been aware of it for the past several hours, as a background condition, something to be managed rather than addressed. She turned. Thorne was still at the curtain line. His color was not good, which meant he'd pushed past whatever the surgical team had recommended, which was not surprising. Farwell was behind him with the expression of someone who had stopped trying to control the situation and was now simply documenting it, and Harlan Voss was standing at the entrance to Bay 2. He had watched the whole thing. She didn't know when he'd come back, sometime during the compression, sometime during the 90 seconds of volume and math. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his lanyard hanging correctly, and his expression doing something she'd never seen it do before. Nothing. No authority, no flatness, no managed professionalism, just a man standing in a doorway watching a situation that had moved entirely beyond his control. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the patient's chart from the rail where Meta had left it and handed it to the nearest nurse. "Make sure this gets to OR2. Complete documentation of the timeline." She walked past Voss without stopping. The news cameras were in the parking lot, which meant the lobby was going to be the next problem. Nora went the back way. Service corridor, the one she knew because she'd been taking it to avoid the parking structure elevator for 8 months, and came out near the administrative stairwell. Voss was waiting for her there, which meant Ruiz had told him which way she'd go, which meant Ruiz was paying attention to more than her shift duties required. "The OR patient," Voss said. "In surgery. He'll make it if they move fast enough." She kept walking. He fell into step. "What's happening with the cameras?" 3 networks. Someone sent them a tip. Anonymous, Federal Exchange prefix. They have the broad outline. Suspended nurse, federal investigation, compliance fraud. They don't have specifics yet. He paused. Breckenridge thinks it was a deliberate move to force the hospital's hand before they could contain the story internally. Who did Breckenridge think sent it? A pause. He thinks it was someone inside the federal team. Farwell? He didn't say. Nora filed that and kept moving. "Where are we on Harwick?" He started talking at 0930. His lawyer negotiated a proffer. He's naming names in exchange for consideration on the obstruction charges. Who is he naming? Voss stopped walking. She stopped too, turned to look at him. He had the legal pad under his arm and the expression of a man delivering news he'd been thinking about how to deliver for the past 30 minutes. "Voss," he said. "And 2 members of the hospital board, and a facilities contractor named Sutton, who's been signing off on the equipment inspections." She looked at him. "Harwick says the arrangement started 7 years ago," Voss continued. "The contractor was giving the board members kickbacks on maintenance contracts. The falsified inspection reports were how they kept the arrangement from being audited. Anyone who filed a safety complaint was getting quietly noted and managed." He paused. "You were on a list, Nora. A specific list of staff whose reports were being flagged for suppression. The service corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed. 7 years was a long time. 7 years was the length of someone's career. 7 years was dozens of equipment failures, hundreds of patients, a specific and documented decision to keep collecting the money and absorb whatever came of it." "How many people were on the list?" she said. 11, current and former staff. You were the most consistent filer." Voss paused. "You were also the one they were most worried about, apparently. Someone in the administrative chain flagged your file as, and this is a quote from Harwick's statement, operationally persistent." Something that might have been dark humor moved through her expression, briefly. "Good," she said, and started walking again. The conference room had become a different space than it had been at 6 in the morning. Where it had held Voss's legal pad and 2 cups of coffee and the careful architecture of a suspension dispute, it now held 4 people Nora didn't know. 2 federal investigators who had arrived from the regional DY office while she'd been in Bay 2. A woman from the state health authority named Parsons, who had the particular energy of someone who had spent years waiting for a specific phone call and had finally received it, and Agent Breckenridge, who had clearly not slept either and was running on the professional equivalent of inertia. Parsons stood up when Nora came in. She was in her late 50s, gray-haired with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the kind of deliberate, unhurried movement that came from decades of dealing with situations where urgency was its own liability. "Miss Calloway," she said, "I've been reviewing your submission records." "All 47?" Nora said. "All 47?" Parsons' expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes acknowledged the weight of that number. I want to tell you that the submission portal flagged an anomaly in our routing system 18 months ago. The flag was reviewed by a junior analyst who determined it was a software error and closed it. It wasn't a software error. No. Parsons looked at the table. The routing for submissions from Mercy Dunmore's service region was being diverted at the processing stage, before they reached active review. The diversion was manual. Someone with system access was redirecting them to an archive queue that wasn't monitored. She looked up. We've been auditing the system since 700 this morning. This is not an isolated problem. We found similar diversions from 3 other regional facilities. The room was quiet for a moment. Breckenridge leaned forward. The contractor, Sutton, had a consulting contract with the state authority. He had system access through a legacy vendor arrangement that was never properly sunset. Nora looked at him. So Harwick wasn't the top of the chain. Harwick was the mechanism. Sutton was the infrastructure. The board members were the financial beneficiaries. Breckenridge paused. We're still mapping the full structure. How many facilities? Minimum of 4, possibly 7. We're pulling records. She sat down. The fatigue hit her in a wave that, not overwhelming, just present, the kind that settled into the joints rather than the mind. She had been awake for over 20 hours. She had managed 2 near-fatal trauma cases, identified a delayed abdominal injury at another facility, navigated a suspension, a federal debrief, a coercion attempt, and a resuscitation. And the morning was still technically happening. What do you need from me? She said. Parsons opened a folder. A formal recorded statement covering every safety report you filed, the responses you received, and any direct interactions with administrative staff regarding those reports. She looked at Nora over her reading glasses. It will take several hours. I know. And I want to say something first before we begin. Parsons closed the folder. I've been in health authority compliance for 21 years. I have reviewed a lot of safety report histories. The documentation you maintained, the parallel copies, the portal timestamps, the incident logs you kept outside the hospital system. She paused. That's not standard practice. Most people file and move on and trust the system to do its job. The system wasn't doing its job, Nora said. No, Parsons said. It wasn't, but you kept filing anyway. She looked at her steadily. That's what we're working with today. Your documentation is the spine of this entire case. The statement took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Nora went through it methodically. Dates, submissions, incident specifics, the equipment failures she'd witnessed, the responses she'd received, the specific conversations with administrative staff. She described the night in Bay 2 with the defibrillator. She described the crash cart. She described the elevator and the 6 facilities forms, and the parking structure, and the way the stairwell light on level 3 had been out for 11 days. She described all of it without editorializing, without anger, without the particular dramatic weight that the situation arguably deserved. She just described it. What happened, when, what she did, what response she received. Clean and sequential. Breckenridge recorded it. The federal investigator took notes. Parsons asked clarifying questions in a steady, low voice. When it was done, Nora drank a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was talking and looked at the wall. In that time, 2 things had happened in the building that she didn't learn about until Voss told her. The hospital board had called an emergency session, and Harlan Voss had walked out of the building. Not dramatically, not loudly. He had left through the physician entrance at the back of the parking structure at 11:45 a.m., got into his car, and driven away. Security had not stopped him because there was no legal mechanism yet to stop him. But 2 of Breckenridge's people had followed. That was the part Voss said with the tone of a man who found it quietly satisfying. The board session was messier. Nora didn't have direct access to it, but Parsons did. And what Parsons reported when she returned from a 15-minute phone call was that 2 of the 5 board members had immediately retained private counsel. 1 had requested a recess that had been denied, and the remaining 2 were in the process of separating themselves from the decision-making chain as quickly as institutional language allowed. The board chair is a woman named Willadora Berti, Parsons said. She's been on the board 9 years. She's also been receiving quarterly payments from Sutton's consulting firm through a shell entity. Is she talking? Voss asked. Her lawyer is talking. Parsons looked at her notes. The lawyer is indicating she was unaware of the source of the payments. A pause. We'll see what the financial records say. What the financial records said over the course of the next several hours was considerably more than what Willa Doherty's lawyer wanted them to say. The federal investigators worked through the afternoon. Nora was aware of it in the way you're aware of weather when you're indoors, the sense of pressure building outside while you sit still in the middle of it. Breckenridge's team and the state authority moved in coordination. The contractor Sutton was located at his office in the city and brought in for questioning at 2:30 p.m. His attorney arrived within 20 minutes, which suggested he'd been waiting for the call. At 3:15 p.m., Nora was still in the building, technically a civilian federal witness with no clinical standing and no hospital badge, when Farwell appeared in the conference room doorway and asked if she could come upstairs. Thorne was sitting up in the recovery room bed, which he should not have been doing 8 hours after abdominal surgery, but the nurses had apparently decided that telling him to lie down was a fight they weren't winning. He looked better than he had at 5 a.m. and worse than a person should look who had just had reconstructive vascular surgery, which was roughly where Nora had expected him to land. You're sitting up, she said. I'm comfortable. You're uncomfortable, and you're sitting up because lying down makes you feel like a patient. He looked at her, the ghost of that almost smile again. Farwell said you gave a 3-hour statement. 3:40? How are you holding up? I'm fine. She sat in the chair. The second surgical patient is out of the OR. Aldous says the splenectomy went well. He'll have a recovery, but he'll recover. She paused. Thorne, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The incident that brought you here. The blast event. She looked at him steadily. Was it targeted? The room was quiet. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. That's an active investigation, he said finally. I know. Was it targeted? Another pause. Longer. The device placement suggests deliberate positioning, not opportunistic. He held her gaze. That's as far as I can go. She nodded. Sat with that for a moment. Then you need to be somewhere more secure than a regional hospital recovery room. The transfer team is coming tonight. Good. She looked at him. The records. The sealed file. Farwell told me about the commendation. He didn't look away. I should have pushed harder to get it processed. The classification order blocked it. I know. But I should have... He stopped. Tried again. There were things I could have done differently, not in the field. After. His jaw was tight. You disappeared and we were told you were gone, and then the investigation closed and the record sealed and the official version was, it didn't match what I knew. It matched what you were allowed to say. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. They sat in that for a moment. The monitoring equipment ran its quiet numbers. Outside the window, Denton Falls was moving into the flat gray of late afternoon. What are you going to do? He said. After this? She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. The nursing license is clean. The federal witness status protects you from retaliatory termination. He paused. There are programs, civilian-military coordination, trauma training. People who know your background would, one thing at a time, she said. Not sharply, just the way she said things. Let's finish this first. She went back downstairs. The cameras were still outside. Someone, Breckenridge's team, she assumed, had issued a brief statement to the effect that a federal review of hospital compliance practices was in progress, and further details would be available at a later time. The networks were running the story with the broad strokes: federal investigation, suspended nurse, compliance fraud, unnamed military official. It was enough to be significant and not enough to be specific, which meant the story was going to keep running until there were specifics, which meant someone needed to manage when and how those specifics came out. That wasn't Nora's job. She was clear about that. She had given her statement. She had documented her part. The rest of it, the press, the board, the legal proceedings, was machinery that ran without her participation and would run whether or not she was in the building. At 4:45 p.m., Gerald Foss appeared at her elbow with the expression of a man carrying news and choosing his moment. "Voss turned himself in," he said, "an hour ago. Walked into the federal field office downtown with his attorney." She stopped, looked at him. "Voluntarily?" "According to Breckenridge." Foss paused. "He's cooperating, offering a full statement in exchange for consideration." She was quiet for a moment. "What does his statement cover?" "The arrangement with Sutton, his role in flagging staff reports for suppression, specific conversations with Doherty and the two other board members." Foss paused. "And something else. Something that's been bothering me all day, actually." He looked at her carefully. "He's saying there was pressure from above the board, not just Sutton, someone higher in the contracting chain who wanted specific facilities kept out of state review." She went very still. "Sutton wasn't independent," she said. "Not a question." "Apparently not." Foss looked at his legal pad. "Voss says he received a phone call 2 years ago from someone he describes as a federal contractor, not DI, not any agency he could clearly identify, who told him the compliance submissions from Mercy Dunmore needed to stay quiet. Not because of the kickback scheme, for a different reason that Voss says he was never fully explained. The conference room. The statement she'd given. 47 reports, 3 years, the particular specificity of her name on a list. A federal contractor with an interest in keeping a specific regional hospital out of regulatory scrutiny, she said slowly. For a reason unrelated to the kickback scheme. That's what Voss is saying. And the other facilities, the 3 others with diverted submissions. Also in Mercy Dunmore's regional cluster. Voss paused. Breckenridge looked pale when he heard it, which, for Breckenridge, is saying something. She thought about the phone call she'd received at 5 a.m. The flat Midwestern accent, the particular economy of speech, the way he'd known about the compliance reports before she'd mentioned them, the way he'd said they were already in front of the right people. She thought about who defined the right people. She pulled out her phone, looked at the call log. The Federal Exchange number she'd called back at 5:15 a.m., the one that had picked up on the second ring and known exactly who she was. She looked at the number for a long moment. Then she looked at Foss. "I need Breckenridge, right now." Foss was already moving. She stood in the conference room with the phone in her hand and the particular clarity of someone who has been tired for a very long time and has just understood something that makes the tiredness irrelevant. The pieces were there. They'd been there since the beginning. She just hadn't had enough of the picture to see the shape. Iron Veil, a classified program, a sealed record, a woman officially listed as casualties unconfirmed who had not actually been a casualty, a hospital in a specific region, safety reports buried not for money, but for something else, a phone call at 5 a.m. from someone who had answered too quickly and known too much, the facility codes Thorne had given her last night, the 2 other injured staff, the message she'd left with Hendricks Regional's director. She had initiated contact. She had given her name. She had flagged her location and her assessment and her knowledge base to a facility she had no reason to distrust. But someone who had been monitoring Iron Veil personnel for years would have been monitoring incoming clinical contacts to facilities handling a blast event injury cluster. She had flagged herself. Breckenridge came through the door at a near jog and stopped when he saw her face. "The phone call I made at 5 a.m., she said. "The Federal Exchange number. I need you to run that number right now and tell me what agency it routes to." Breckenridge looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he was on his phone. She waited. Foss stood near the wall. The conference room was very still. Breckenridge turned back to her. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. A kind of controlled alarm, the expression of a man whose professional architecture has just shifted unexpectedly under his feet. "It doesn't route to any active federal agency," he said. "Contractor?" she said. "The exchange is registered to a defense services contracting entity, dissolved 14 months ago." He paused. "On paper." "Who ran it?" He looked at her. "The registered director is a name I need to run through clearance before I share it. But I can tell you—" He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up. "The contracting entity has a filing address that matches the facility location of the Iron Veil program." He paused. Pre-decommission. The room was very quiet. Someone kept the program running, she said. Not loudly, just as a fact. After the official decommission, off the books, and they've been making sure that anyone connected to Iron Veil who surfaced in a civilian context stayed quiet and stayed manageable. And when Thorne walked through those doors tonight, I stopped being manageable, she said. Breckenridge's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression did something complicated. He turned the phone around and showed her the screen. The name on it was not one she recognized, but the facility code listed below it, the one Thorne had given her last night, handwritten on a hospital notepad and folded once into her pocket, matched exactly. She looked at the screen for a long moment. The two staff from Thorne's incident, she said carefully, the ones at Hendricks Regional. Yes, said Breckenridge. Who arranged their transfer there? The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time in a quiet room. I need to make some calls, Breckenridge said. You need to call Hendricks Regional right now, she said, and you need to find out who authorized that transfer and who has had access to those patients since admission. He was already moving. Nora stood in the conference room with Foss, who had stopped writing and was looking at her with the expression of a man who had started the morning handling a suspension dispute and was now somewhere considerably farther from that than he'd expected to be. Are you in danger? He said. She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. That's not a reassuring answer. I know. She picked up her phone. But it's the most honest thing I can tell you. She looked at the call log again. The number she'd trusted. The call she'd answered because the prefix looked right, and the voice had sounded like someone with the correct kind of authority. She thought about all the years she'd been careful, all the years she'd been invisible, and then she thought about the fact that she'd been on a list. Not Harwick's list, not the kickback list, a different list. For long enough that someone had built infrastructure around keeping her quiet, which meant they'd known where she was for some or all of those 4 years. Which meant the ordinary life she'd built here, the overnight shifts and the parking garage stairs and the 47 reports that went nowhere, had never been as invisible as she'd thought it was. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different prefix from the 5 a.m. call. Not federal, not contractor. Local to Denton Falls. She answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, mid-30s, flat effect, the particular vocal quality of someone reading from a prepared statement. Ms. Calloway, there's a vehicle in the hospital parking structure, level 2, Bay 14. The driver would like to speak with you. A pause. He says to tell you the standing order has been amended. The line went dead. She stood with the phone against her ear for a moment after the call ended. Then she lowered it. Foss was watching her. What was that? She looked at the door. She looked at the phone. She looked at the small, careful architecture of the day she'd spent. The statement, the compliance records, Thorne in the recovery room, Voss in federal custody, the board session, the contractor, the number that routed to a dissolved entity with a matching facility code. All of it pointing somewhere. All of it converging. I need to make one more call, she said, and then I need you to stay in this room. Nora Gerald. She looked at him. Whatever is in that parking structure, it's the last piece. I can feel it. She paused. And I need someone who knows the whole story to stay somewhere safe while I go find out what it is. She called Breckenridge, told him about the call, told him the location, told him to give her 3 minutes and then send people. He said 2 minutes. She said 3. She went to the parking structure the back way, through the service corridor and the stairwell. She knew better than the people who worked day shift, and she came out on level 2 at Bay 14 and found a black sedan with government plates that were issued by a state she couldn't immediately identify. The driver's window came down. She did not recognize the man behind the wheel, 50s, unremarkable face, the particular practiced neutrality of someone who had spent a career being forgettable, but she recognized the ID he held up, not the name, not the agency, but the specific format and the specific embossing that she had last seen on a document inside a classified briefing room 7 years ago. He looked at her steadily. There are things you've started today that cannot be undone, he said. We're not here to stop them. Then why are you here? She said. He reached to the passenger seat and picked up a folder. plain manila. He held it out through the window. Because the people who were running the suppression operation weren't authorized to do it, he said. They were using infrastructure from a program that was supposed to be decommissioned to protect a private financial arrangement. He paused. And they've been using your identity as a cover within that infrastructure for 3 years. She took the folder. Your sealed service record was accessed 14 times over the past 4 years, he said. Not by us, by them. The same contractor entity that Breckenridge is tracing right now. He held her gaze. The compliance reports you filed, the reason they were being specifically suppressed wasn't only about the kickback scheme. 2 of the facilities in this cluster are located adjacent to sites that appear in your Iron Veil operational records. He paused. Someone was afraid that a safety investigation into these hospitals would accidentally surface documentation that would lead back to the program. She looked at the folder. She didn't open it. And the commendation, she said, the one Thorne filed, was blocked because processing it would have required acknowledging your operational record, which would have required acknowledging that you survived the incident. He paused. Which would have made certain people ask where you'd been for 4 years. She held the folder. There's a name in there, he said. The individual who authorized the use of your sealed identity within the contractor infrastructure. They didn't work for us. They worked adjacent to us, which is how they had access. He paused. We became aware of this arrangement approximately 6 months ago. We've been preparing a referral to the Inspector General's office. He looked at her steadily. Tonight accelerated that timeline considerably. Behind her, she heard the stairwell door open. Breckenridge's people. Exactly on schedule. She looked at the man in the car. Why are you giving this to me instead of directly to the IG? He looked at her for a long moment. Because you filed 47 reports, he said quietly. And not one of them was about yourself. She held the folder for another moment. Then she stepped back from the car. The sedan's engine turned over. The window came up. The car moved toward the exit at the same pace it might move under any other circumstances. Unhurried, unremarkable. The vehicle of someone who had delivered what they came to deliver and was leaving before the moment became anything more than it needed to be. Breckenridge appeared at her left shoulder with 2 of his people behind him. He looked at the sedan. He looked at the folder. He looked at Nora. Do I want to know what just happened? He said. She held the folder out to him. Open it, she said. He opened it. She watched his face as he read the first page. She watched the moment his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just the quiet reorganization of a man who has just understood that the case he thought he was working is considerably larger than it was this morning, and that the person standing next to him has been, for 4 years and 47 reports, and one very long night, carrying a piece of it that nobody knew she was carrying. There's a name on page 3, she said. He turned to page 3. He went very still. And in the parking structure on level 2 of Mercy Dunmore Medical Center, in the gray afternoon light that came through the concrete gaps between floors, Nora Calloway stood and waited for whatever came next. Not with the patience of someone who had given up expecting justice, but with the stillness of someone who had waited this long and knew, for the first time in 4 years, that waiting was almost over. Breckenridge read the name on page 3 twice. Then he took out his phone and made a call without explaining himself, which told Nora the name had meant something immediate to him. Not a stranger, not an unknown. The recognition of a person who existed already in some operational context he'd been carrying. He walked 4 paces away and spoke in the low, compact sentences of someone transmitting information rather than discussing it. She let him. She stood in Bay 14 of Level 2 and looked at the concrete and thought about a name she hadn't read yet. She'd handed the folder over before she'd gotten to page 3 herself, which was either disciplined or avoidant, and she wasn't going to decide which right now. Breckenridge came back. You didn't read it, he said. I gave it to you. Do you want to know? She thought about it. Yes, he told her. The name was a man named Dwight Callum, who had been a contracting administrator attached to a defense logistics office in Virginia, who had been, 7 years ago, one of the administrative handlers for the Iron Veil program's operational budget, who had, after the program's official decommission, retained access to its sealed personnel files through a legacy authorization that nobody had audited, who had built a private arrangement using the program's infrastructure, its personnel codes, its operational language, to serve as a silent compliance buffer for Sutton's contracting network across 6 regional hospital clusters, and who had, 3 years ago, specifically flagged Nora Calloway's sealed identity as an asset to be monitored and managed, because her continued presence at Mercy Dunmore created a risk that a safety investigation might surface documentation adjacent to Iron Vale operational sites. She hadn't been paranoid. She hadn't been unlucky. She had been, for 4 years, specifically and deliberately kept small by someone who understood exactly how large she could become if the right pressure was applied to the right moment. "Is he in custody?" she said. "Being picked up now." Breckenridge paused. "Virginia Field Office. He went home for lunch, apparently." A pause with something dry in it. "He didn't make it back to the office." She nodded. "Nora." He used her name, which he hadn't done before. "This is going to take months to fully prosecute. The scope, the 6 facilities, the contractor network, Callum's use of the sealed records, it's not a quick process. I know how federal investigations work. What I'm saying is that your part in it is not going to be quiet. You're going to be a witness, a named party, a documented figure in a case that's going to attract attention." She looked at him. "You're telling me I can't be invisible anymore." "I'm telling you the choice was already made. Last night, when Thorne walked through those doors." He held her gaze. "I just want to make sure you've thought about what that means." She had. She'd been thinking about it since 2 a.m. in a hallway chair outside a surgical suite. "I've thought about it," she said. He nodded, closed the folder, held it out. "Then this is yours. We'll need it officially, but you should read page 3 yourself." She took the folder. She read page 3. It was strange seeing your own name in a document written by someone who had been afraid of you. Not a dramatic strangeness, just the quiet, disorienting fact of it, that a man she'd never met had spent 3 years making decisions about her life based on what she might eventually do. And what she might eventually do had turned out to be exactly what she'd always done. File the reports, show up to the shift, do the work. She handed the folder back. They walked out of the parking structure together into the late afternoon, and the news cameras were still there, and she did not stop to talk to them because she had nothing to say to cameras yet, and everything to say to the process that was already moving without her. The next 6 weeks were not clean or linear or satisfying in any real-time way. Investigations did not feel like justice while they were happening. They felt like paperwork and phone calls and depositions, and the particular grinding endurance of institutional machinery working at its own pace, regardless of how urgently the people inside it needed it to move faster. Harlan Voss entered a formal cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors 11 days after leaving the hospital. His statement covered 7 years of administrative decisions, the flagged reports, the conversations with Harwick, a specific phone call from Dwight Callum 2 years prior in which Callum had explained, obliquely and deniably, that certain compliance pressures in the region needed to remain managed. Voss had made a choice in that phone call. He'd made it for the reasons people usually made those choices: his career, his position, the particular cowardice of a man who understood that looking away was technically not the same as acting. His medical license was suspended pending the investigation's outcome. His hospital privileges at Mercy Dunmore were revoked before the week was out. He didn't contest either action, which was its own kind of answer about how much he'd believed in his own position by the end. Willa Doherty, the board chair, lasted longer. Her attorney was skilled and the financial documentation was complex, and she spent 3 weeks maintaining that the shell entity payments were a legitimate consulting arrangement she'd had no reason to scrutinize. The financial forensics team dismantled that argument with the particular patience of people who had done it before and understood that complexity was not the same as obscurity. She resigned from the board in week 4. The criminal referral for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty came in week 5. The 2 remaining board members who had received payments cooperated early and fully and received consideration for it. That was the nature of these things. Nora didn't find it satisfying, but she found it accurate. The people who moved first got the better deal, which created incentives to move first, which was how the full picture got assembled faster than it would have otherwise. Justice was not elegant. It was a machine with a lot of moving parts and a lot of negotiated outcomes. And the alternative to imperfect justice was no justice. And she had lived long enough in a building where reports went nowhere to understand very clearly which of those she preferred. Dwight Callum was indicted on 5 counts, including unauthorized access to classified personnel records, conspiracy to obstruct federal safety investigations, and misuse of sealed government program infrastructure. He made no public statement. His attorney made several, none of which contained the word accountability. The contractor Sutton pleaded out. Harwick cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced charge. The regional compliance system was audited across all 6 affected facility clusters, and the state health authority underwent a structural review of its submission processing protocols that resulted in 3 administrative terminations and a complete rebuild of the routing system. Mercy Dunmore Medical Center closed its emergency department for 14 days for a full equipment audit. It reopened under interim leadership. The board had been restructured, the administrative positions vacated, and a nationally recognized patient safety consultant brought in to manage the transition. Every piece of equipment Nora had flagged was replaced or recertified. The crash cart in the trauma hall was the first thing they pulled. She wasn't there to see it. She was somewhere else. The Army processed the commendation in 3 weeks, which was either fast or slow, depending on your expectations of bureaucratic timelines, and which Farwell said was fast. The classification order was lifted from a specific subset of Nora's service record. Not everything, not the operational details, but enough to establish the formal record of her service, her deployment, her role in a program that had done significant work under conditions that had never been publicly acknowledged. The gap in her personnel file closed. The official designation of casualties unconfirmed was amended. The word they replaced it with was active. The ceremony was small. Thorne had requested it that way, and Nora had been grateful he'd understood without being asked. A room at a naval administrative facility in the region, 8 people present, no press. Thorne was in uniform. He'd recovered well, all things considered, though the left arm was still in a partial brace and would be for another month, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned once again the limits of what a body would absorb. Farwell was there. Breckenridge was there. Foss was there, which had not been required but which meant something. Meta had been invited and had come, which had also not been required and which meant considerably more than something. Thorne pinned the commendation while Farwell read the citation. The citation covered the operational actions in specific enough terms to be meaningful and general enough terms to remain classified, which was the only version Nora had ever expected. It described, in the careful language of military documentation, a series of decisions made under conditions that had not allowed for hesitation by a person who had not hesitated. When Farwell finished reading, the room was quiet. Thorne looked at Nora. "The world forgot your name," he said, "but it never forgot what you did." She looked at him. She thought about the hallway chair outside the surgical suite. She thought about 47 reports. She thought about the parking structure stairs and the fluorescent lights, and the particular loneliness of being invisible by design. She thought about all the times she'd made the right call in a room full of people who hadn't seen it, and all the years she'd shown up anyway. "I didn't do it to be remembered," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why it's worth remembering." She looked at the commendation in her hands. It was a physical object, metal and ribbon and the weight of official documentation. And it was also the proof that a record existed, that her service was real, that the gap in her file had been a lie told by afraid people and not a fact about who she was. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket. The room exhaled. Meta found her afterward, outside, in the kind of late autumn air that Denton Falls produced in November, cold and clear and without pretense. They stood together for a moment without talking, which was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. "Are you going back to the hospital?" Meta asked. "I don't know yet." Nora meant it honestly. The interim director reached out. "There's a position if I want it." "Do you want it?" She thought about the overnight shifts, the weight of knowing things nobody listened to, the particular discipline of caring for people in a building that didn't care for itself. "Part of me does," she said, Part of me wants to be somewhere that isn't already a place I know how to survive. Meta looked at the street. There's a trauma training fellowship, she said. Civilian, military, new program. I heard they're looking for someone to run the clinical curriculum. She paused. Someone told me you'd be good at it. Someone. Farwell. A pause. And Thorne. And also, I think Breckenridge mentioned it, which was unexpected. Nora looked at the street too. She thought about what Thorne had said in the recovery room, in a different context, teaching emergency teams how to recognize what most physicians never encountered. She thought about Aldous in the OR, writing on his palm, the knowledge transferred in 40 seconds because someone who had it gave it to the person who needed it. She thought about Okafor at Hendricks Regional, and what it had meant that she'd made that call, and what would have happened if she hadn't known what she knew. I'll think about it, she said. That's not a no, Meta said. No, Nora agreed. It's not. She went back to her apartment that night, the one she'd lived in for 4 years, 3 blocks from the hospital, on a street she'd chosen because it was quiet and had a good angle for watching the weather come in off the hills. She sat on the couch in the dark for a while. Not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, just because the day had been very long and the year had been very long, and there was something necessary about sitting in the quiet for a few minutes before deciding what to do with the rest of it. She thought about Callum reading her file and being afraid of her. She turned that over slowly, like something she'd found in a drawer and wasn't sure she recognized. A man with access to every documented thing she'd ever done in service had looked at that record and understood that the safest thing to do was make sure she stayed quiet and small and unremarkable in a regional hospital on an overnight shift. He hadn't been wrong about what she could do. He'd just miscalculated the part where doing it quietly for 4 years doesn't change what it is. She was 31 years old. She had a nursing license, a military commendation, 47 documented safety reports, and the particular kind of knowledge that comes from having been tested in conditions that left no room for performance. She had worked in a building where the system failed and done the right thing anyway, not because she'd expected to be seen, but because the patient in front of her needed it done. That was the thing nobody told you about integrity. It didn't require an audience. It didn't build toward a moment. It was just the accumulation of 1,000 small decisions made in rooms where nobody was watching. And the choices you made in those rooms were the actual architecture of who you were, and no suppression order and no falsified inspection record, and no man in Virginia with access to a sealed file could dismantle what you'd built in the dark. She picked up her phone, typed a message to Farwell. Tell me more about the fellowship. She put the phone down, looked at the window. The hills were dark shapes against a dark sky, the same as they'd been every night for 4 years. And the room was the same room, and she was the same person. And also, in the specific way that matters, she wasn't. 3 months later, Mercy Dunmore Medical Center reopened its emergency department with a new patient safety framework that had been, in its foundational documentation, built around the 47 reports filed by a trauma nurse on overnight shifts between the years of her disappearance and her reappearance. Her name was in the acknowledgments section. She hadn't asked for that. The interim director had put it there anyway, and when Nora read it, she sat with it for a moment and then decided it was right. Not because she needed the credit, but because the record should say what it said. And the record was that a person no one was watching had been watching for everyone, and that had mattered. The Civilian Military Trauma Fellowship launched its first training cohort in the spring. Nora ran the clinical curriculum. She was not a perfect teacher. She was direct in ways that took some students time to adjust to. And she had a low tolerance for the kind of theoretical confidence that hadn't been tested against actual decision-making. And more than once, she had to stop herself from expecting that other people would absorb a technique in the 40 seconds it took her to demonstrate it. She was working on that. What she was not working on was holding back. She taught everything she knew. The blast trauma presentations, the vascular signatures, the delayed abdominal injury patterns, the specific clinical language that let you hand off a complex case to someone who had never seen it and give them what they needed in the time you had. She taught it all, because that was what it was for. On the last day of the first cohort, one of the residents, a young woman from a regional hospital in the South, the kind of resident who asked twice as many questions as anyone else and occasionally got it right before Nora told her the answer. stopped her in the hall. "Can I ask you something?" the resident said. "Go ahead." "How did you know, in the beginning, when no one was listening? How did you know you were right?" Nora looked at her. The question was honest. It deserved an honest answer. "I didn't always," she said. "I was wrong sometimes. I second-guessed myself more often than I showed." She paused. "But I knew what I was looking at. I'd seen it before. And when you know what you're looking at and someone tells you that you don't, you have two choices. You can decide they're right because they have a title, or you can trust what your training and your eyes and your hands are telling you." She held the resident's gaze. "The patient doesn't care about the title. The patient cares whether someone is willing to stand in the room and do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable." The resident nodded slowly. "What if you stand in the room and nobody listens?" "You document it," Nora said. "You file the report, you keep a copy, you do it again." She paused. "And if that's not enough, you figure out who has the authority to listen and you find a way to make them hear it." A pause. "It took me 4 years. It won't take everyone that long. But the answer to not being heard is not to stop saying it." The resident stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," with the particular sincerity of someone who has just been told something they'll be carrying for a long time. Nora watched her go. She stood in the hallway of a building that was not a hospital, in a city that was not Denton Falls, in a version of her life that had opened up on the far side of the longest night she'd worked in 4 years. And she thought about the 47 reports, and the commendation in her pocket, and the man who had been afraid of her, and the patient in Bay 1 who had looked at her and said, "You're the one," and Vice Admiral Marcus Thorne walking through ambulance doors and stopping as though the world had rearranged itself around a single point. She thought about all of it, and then she let it settle into the place where it belonged. Not behind her, not forgotten, but integrated. Part of the architecture. She had work to do. She went back to the classroom, and she did it.